distinguished guests, friends, I'm very glad to join the second Shanghai Fintech International Forum upon invitation. Well, I was supposed to be in Beijing attending another event. Well, somehow, I'm here in Shanghai. The head of the SAIF, Xing Yi, sent me a WeChat message last night saying he hoped that I could be here, and he understands I will always support the alliance regardless of whether or not I can be here. So seeing his management master, and I think he said regardless of whether you can be here or not, we will always welcome your support. So thanks to his words, I currently rejected the Beijing event and took a flight came to Shanghai today. Well, we are approaching the end of the year, and there are always lots of events holding by the end of the year. Beijing and Shanghai, these are two centers. Beijing is the capital and Shanghai is the financial center. Well, I attended a number of events in Beijing in the last 4 or 5 days. So now I'm back at Shanghai. Well, I think I should be here. Why so? Comparing to other events, I think this event has 3 main features. Speaking of fintech, well, people are talking about fintech these days. It's a hot topic. But this event is different. It is walking its talk. Of course, we need to study fintech, exchange ideas on fintech. But meanwhile, fintech is also a topic that is rather practical. And it needs pragmatic measures. So we have talked about the policies, the theories, and the cooperations and measures. For instance, we had the signing ceremony earlier today, and we are also going to carry out lots of fintech cooperation projects. That's the first feature, practicality. And secondly, fintech is something that involves both the financial agencies and the technology firms, the public sector and the private sector, as well as the regulators. So there are lots of subjects of different natures in this circle. We need the synergy among different parties to develop fintech. And thirdly, versus also a forum that links the domestic parties and international parties. Fintech itself is an international phenomenon. And fintech shows different features in different countries. For instance, in the UK, it has done lots of attempts in regulatory area. It has its own distinctive features. In the US, it focuses more on technology. Technology is the support, the backbone of fintech. US is leading the world in technology development. For China, we have a large market and a wide range of application scenarios. Given that, we do need exchanges among different countries. So these are the 3 highlights of today's forum. Academician Chai is going to be the second keynote speaker. I said I will warm up the venue for him. And we know that Academician Chai is our old friend. Probably I've known him for 20, 30 years. He was with PBOC in the early stage of his career, and he's done lots of work in promoting the fintech system, the e-payment system, the foreign exchange system, and etc. He's made great contributions while he's with PBOC. So later on, I believe his keynote speech will definitely be a highlight of today's forum. My speech will serve as a appetizer. Well, I'll talk about the development of fintech and the regulation of fintech companies. I'd like to share with you some of my personal views. Well, why this topic? We've been talking a lot about fintech. Experts, representatives of different organizations have already touched upon these issues. For instance, its application, the business pattern, the fintech ecosystem, and etc. Last year, I also delivered a speech from this perspective. So I'm sure you are all very familiar with this. Another perspective is the risk perspective. Last year, I mentioned that fintech may deliver some new kinds of risks. Well, from fintech to fintech firms, the transition shows that our understanding has been deepened. Well, for instance, on financial and its IPO and the stop of its IPO has raised people's interest, has further raised people's interest in how to regulate fintech companies. Indeed, how to regulate fintech companies is an important topic for all of us. It's a hot topic, and it is something that must be done well. Given that, I'd like to share with you some of my initial perspectives. I welcome your comments. Well, before diving into the regulation of fintech companies, I'd like to first of all share with you several questions. What is fintech industry? And second, how do we define fintech companies? What are the relationships between fintech companies and financial institutions and technology companies? And why do we need to regulate fintech companies, and how to regulate? All of these questions require proper answers, especially when drafting regulatory policies. Well, before talking about fintech companies, first of all, let's have a short overview of the fintech landscape. Fintech is now restructuring the global financial landscape. Just a short overview. Well, the essence of fintech is technology-driven financial innovation. I'm sure you all agree. There are different descriptions of fintech. For instance, PBOC has issued documents on fintech, and FSB has also defined fintech in its document. And secondly, fintech can be applied in different industries and can enable different sectors. Specifically, we could divide fintech into different areas, for instance, credit and loan, insurance, security, asset management, payment, regulatory, for instance, smart advisory investor, smart investment advisor, and etc. But how do we understand the range of fintech? Well, actually, the range can be represented by the fintech index. We could understand the performance of the fintech industry from the index perspective, because the market is always dynamic, and by assessing the indexes, we could understand the development, the status quo of the fintech industry. For instance, in the US, we have the Nasdaq fintech indicator and etc. The capital market plays a key role in expanding the scale of fintech innovation. Why so? Because the capital market is the most direct way in showing the scale of the fintech innovation. For instance, the up and down of the stock price, the changes in their performances. These all show the scale of relevant activities. Within the capital market, we should pay special attention to VCs. The fintech development is headed by fintech companies. And fintech companies, most of them start from startups, from scratch. So venture capitals, in this regard, plays a key role in helping these startups to grow. Here we can see lots of indicators. Well, in the interest of time, I won't draw on that. How do we understand the performance of fintech industry, and how do we evaluate VC's role in expanding the scale of this industry? Well, by the end of the day, it's all about the supply and demand. Fintech itself is the supply side, and for the demand side, we have financial institutions and lots of different kinds of organizations. So here, the supply and demand drives fintech, drives the commercialization of fintech outcomes. Well, we just reviewed briefly what is the fintech industry and how do we evaluate the industry. Well, from the indicators perspective, from the capital markets perspective, and from the supply and demand perspective. Well, moving on to the second part, the recognition criteria of fintech company. I think the criteria is a basic requirement for regulation. How do we define fintech companies? What is the criteria? This is a topic that we're studying. Well, we could understand this from several perspectives. We should have some common understandings in this regard. First of all, fintech is a broad concept that covers a broad spectrum. It has several features, and these are its basic features. For instance, in the underlying technology, the product pattern, the market entity, and industrial cooperation. That's the definition. And secondly, fintech companies should have key technologies. So while drafting the criteria while defining fintech companies, this is one of the important perspectives. Nationwide, we can see these are the key technologies used in fintech pilot programs. For instance, here you can see big data, or data in general, is the most frequently used technology in fintech pilot projects.
So that is to say the companies must have their core advantages and technologies. And these technologies are not just the showing pieces. They must be put into practice. And these are the fundamentals and the criteria for classifying a company to be a fintech company. And third, from the company's businesses, how can we define them as fintech company? First of all, here's something that we can discuss. What's the status quo? And the newly established fintech company registered at the Commerce Department in China, we can see that there is a huge number of registration. So how can we decide or define them to be fintech company? The status quo is that there are many companies already existed, registered to be a fintech company. And that's the status quo or basis. According to our statistics, since 2006 all the way to 2020, you can see that these are the figures. Accumulatively, I think there are more than 1,000 fintech companies registered. As you can see that in 2016, 2014, and 2015, the 3 years, we've seen a surge of new companies registered. This year, it's unlikely to exceed the level of last year. The reason is multifaceted. So that's what we can tell from the numbers. And second, the classification, while the companies are registering, they are divided into two types. The first is the fintech companies, which means that they have direct cooperation with the financial institutions, or their main business is to support financial institutions with their core technologies. And the second type, which is large in number, that is a fintech technology provider. So these providers might partly just provide some technologies. It might provide services and technologies to financial institutions or to fintech companies. So such fintech technology providers a little bit at the downstream, but services providing to and technologies providing to these financial institutions are not their not everything they do. They also providing technologies to fintech companies. Let me give you an example. So far, we don't have a clear-cut definition of fintech company, but locally, when these companies are serving the fintech sectors and financial sectors development, previously at the occasion of the inclusion conference, I mentioned that how we can use fintech technology to change the local development landscape, because everywhere is developing fintech across China. According to statistics, so far we have more than 10 local governments have issued their fintech development planning or strategy or the policies that are related to fintech development, including Shanghai. In Shanghai, we have specifically set our positioning to be the national fintech center, and we also have very detailed action plan. Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and among other first-tier cities, and even some provinces have policies in this regard. So the provinces with a very good financial industry development have issued such documents as well. We have received, I have seen personally more than 20 such documents. So they want to have a better finance landscape with better resources concentrated. Of course, while they are supporting fintech development and their finance sector, they have to depend on the fintech entities. Apart from that, they need to provide policies and environment. Let me give you an example. Shenzhen has categorized the fintech companies registered there into 4 types. First, the licensed fintech company subsidiaries. Because these subsidiaries are specifically established to serve their financial institutions, their holding companies. And now these financial institutions that are setting up subsidiaries are huge ones. I don't know that our guests from financial institutions here, whether they have set their subsidiaries or not. And I know that some major banks have set up their subsidiaries in fintech area. And also I noticed that for these financial institutions, especially big banks, the subsidiaries that they have set up serve not just their parent institution, but there's no limitation for such subsidiaries to provide technologies and services to other companies. Well, this is something I'm particularly interested in because that's very important going forward. The fintech subsidiaries, the scope of the service of such subsidiaries. A second type is the technology companies that provide services and technologies, and these are established by internet giants. Well, on one hand, we have financial institutions setting up institutions, and on the other hand, we have tech giants setting up fintech subsidiaries and trying to penetrate into the financial sector. And the third type is technology companies providing services to financial institutions. They are independent third parties. And the fourth type is other companies that promoting the deep integration between technology and finance. And I guess the fourth type is like the bottom line, so that they can cover all the other areas, all the other companies. They have left some just space for future explorations. So I haven't personally proposed a definition of what is a fintech company, but through this analysis, I want to discuss with you. So how can we define a company to be fintech company? If we don't have a clear definition of it, how can we regulate these companies? Because our authorities have proposed make their decisions about the direction of regulation, but how to actually implement such regulations? These points I've touched upon are actually helpful for us to achieve some consensus in terms of regulation. Although I cannot have a clear conclusion here, but I hope that we can continue to discuss the definition and criteria on this occasion. And third, I want to talk about the actual businesses of fintech companies. Although we don't know what exactly makes a company a fintech company, but in terms of regulation, we must know the details of their businesses. So from the business development, let's look at their current status quo. So what are the key issues or key aspects that we need to pay attention to? Because fintech companies are not financial institutions. They are not carrying out the financial tradings. So the regulation for fintech companies must be different from financial institutions. How can we differentiate these two types of regulations? We should carry out some analysis and research. I can give you some perspectives. First, fintech companies is the entity providing fintech technologies. And because of that, we should have a basic foundation to formulate a basic foundation of the regulation. And second, we should look at their three main businesses types. As of now, these are the three main businesses. The first is digital asset, such as mining, processing of digital asset, and also then operate on the basis of such assets. And second is technical support or technical services. And it is carried out in the form of modeling and algorithm application. And the third type combines the previous two. For example, for Ant Group and Jingdong Suke, such subsidiaries. So far, and these are the three main types of businesses. Of course, within each type, there are further interpretations and subdividing. So due to time constraint, these are the three main types I'm going to mention here. And the key points of regulation for their businesses. Due to the features of fintech companies, I think the priority should be about safeguarding the financial stability, and especially the fintech that have their businesses embedded into the financial system and will have some substantial impact on our credit activities. So I think we need to start from three aspects. The regulating of the entity, from the regulating of That's their business processes influence on the financial industry. So what is the credit activities we are talking about here? That includes the entities or customers, because a market entity may be a customer, and the scope of credit, be it a consumers or market entities, they are all customers. How we identify their credit and formulating a relationship. Of course, leveraging is involved as well. So I think fintech falling into such categories should be a priority for regulation. Fourth, so let's delve deeper. The last one is digital asset and the regulation of digital asset. Well, it's more complicated and requires a stable or more solid foundation, because this is the main assets or main business that fintech companies are providing.
We cannot say in general that we regulate the digital assets as a whole, but we need to further divide data assets into different categories. For instance, the fundamental data assets or original and application-oriented data assets. There are different sovereign rights behind these assets, the ownership, using rights, and etc. The fundamental data assets actually comes from all of you. So we need to develop these data assets into different categories and regulate them accordingly. Based on the basic data assets, we'll have data accounts or digital accounts, and then the trading and transactions. So we do need a comprehensive management system behind all of these. To summarize, to be able to effectively regulate fintech companies, we need to have appropriate measures. If it's not appropriate or proportionate, then it will hinder fintech development, hinder innovations. And if not appropriate or proportionate, the regulations, insufficient regulations, may give rise to new risks. So how do we ensure effective regulations? Well, I don't have any clear, specific answers, but I think we could approach this issue from the following perspectives. The first is to stick to the bottom line while promoting fintech innovation. And secondly, we should have flexible boundaries. And thirdly, we should have regulatory pilots and establish regulatory sandboxes. That's the first point. And secondly, in terms of the development stages, we should alter our regulations based on the development stages. For instance, technological innovation, product stability, market access, and etc. All of these are different stages for the development. Of course, there's also compliance stage. So we need to have flexible policies and targeted regulation. And thirdly, we should be able to regulate companies by their sectors and by their nature. Apart from universal regulations, we should pay special attention to the top fintech companies. For instance, we call those top financial institutions with systematic significance. Why so? Because these institutions play a key role in preventing the spread of systematic risks. We learned the lesson from the 2008 financial crisis. Internationally and domestically, we now understand that financial institutions with systematic importance can have great impact on the system. And similarly, for fintech companies, it's the same thing. Top companies, they boast abundant resources. And they are deeply penetrated in a wide range of application scenarios, and they also have a great impact on the stability of the market. So given that, we do need to pay special attention to the regulation of large fintech companies. For instance, Ant Financial. This is just the beginning. We start from large fintech companies, and we will extend our coverage to a wider range of institutions. We still have a long way to go. So in short, policy and regulation are the ballast for the development of fintech. Well, in the interest of time, I won't elaborate these 6 points. I'm a bit overdue. I'm sure you are all eager to hear academician Chai Hongfeng's keynote speech. The appetizer is not that much of an appetizer, but thank you so much for your listening.